This morning, a 9-year-old girl is among 7 people who were injured after an overnight aerial attack on Kyiv. New video shows firefighters rushing to put out flames after that attack. The explosions just lit up the Kyiv skyline. Ukraine says Russian missiles targeted energy facilities in Kyiv and other cities. The barrage of missiles coming as Ukrainian prosecutors continue to investigate more than 3,000 criminal cases of alleged Russian crimes against children. That's children alone. Yesterday, Secretary of State Tony Blinken described the human toll of Russia's war on the people of Ukraine while speaking to the UN.
Soldiers forced more than 300 civilians, mostly women, children, and elderly people, into a basement not fit for human habitation. There was no room to sit, let alone lie down. When they cried out to their captors that people were sick and needed medical care, a Russian soldier yelled back, "Let them die." The Russians only allowed the removal of bodies once a day. So children, parents, husbands, and wives were forced to spend hours next to the corpses of their loved ones.
What the Secretary describing there is really torture. And joining us now is Dr. Alice Jill Edwards. She's a UN Special Rapporteur on torture and other cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment. She's a UN torture expert. Thank you so much, Dr. Edwards. I've been wanting to get you on the show, and I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me. You recently submitted, just this week, a report from your findings of being on the ground in Ukraine and what you have learned. And to summarize for everyone some of what came out of your report, 2 lines really stuck out to me from your report. I'll read them for everyone. Russia's armed aggression is becoming synonymous with torture and other inhuman cruelty. And even worse was this: these grievous acts appear to be neither random nor incidental, but rather orchestrated as part of a state policy. What did you find? What did you see and hear when you were there to lead you to what is a really horrific and brutal conclusion?
Thanks so much for having me on and for continuing to broadcast these important issues. Look, it's a very grim situation and seems to be getting worse as the conflict continues. I met with a number of victims and survivors of detention by Russian forces in the occupied areas, both men and women. Their stories are quite harrowing. Brutal torture, orchestrated, in my opinion, at the highest levels. I've called on the Russian authorities to send a signal to their soldiers and to the military command that any form of abuse and torture is unacceptable. They haven't done it.
Because this reinforces what has been feared, and hearing it from you, an independent voice in this, is really critical. That what amounts to a policy potentially of torture is being directed right from the top of leadership in Russia. What have you heard from Russia about this?
Look, I sent a long letter to the Russian authorities in which I submitted a number of cases that came from a large collection of credible testimonies back in June. They had 60 days to reply. They haven't done so. This letter that I sent is part of the procedures that I'm part of, which is to advise the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. And I've put them on notice, essentially, that they are required now. They have a duty to investigate and to prosecute their own forces who may have been engaged in this conduct. According to the Ukrainian authorities, they have opened 103,000 proceedings into different types of criminal behavior. Of those, of the detention cases, they report that 90% of their soldiers as well as civilians are reporting torture and other forms of inhuman treatment. The people I spoke to back that up, both victims and survivors, but also their advocates and lawyers. I found the information to be credible. I found a pattern of abuse and a system of abuse. You can't turn a blind eye once you're on notice. And if you don't do anything about it, it is also part of state policy.
I mean, I think no one would, everyone would be excused to have very little confidence that the Russian president would be changing tactic at this point if they have little confidence or hope that that would happen. And so, because as Vladimir Putin is currently himself facing war crimes at the ICC, short of making the war end, if you will, I mean, do you think anything is going to stop this behavior as this drags on? I mean, how do you hold these people accountable?
Look, the road to peace and the road to justice is always a long one. What I was impressed about in this conflict compared to many others is that this documentation and investigation of such war crimes is being undertaken in real time. They are conducting as best as possible with the resources that they have, which is increasing all the time, forensic documentation, as well as taking testimonies, as well as providing support to victims and survivors. But short of the end of the war, there are also challenges to the investigations and prosecutions, not least that the Ukrainians do not have control over much of the territory in which such crimes are being committed. I also heard worries now amongst the Ukrainian authorities that, in fact, after prisoner swaps, those that are left behind are being treated far worse than those that are being released, kind of as an intimidation and threat to all of us in the international community not to speak up and to speak out. So it's a very worrying trend, and peace really is the only way to solve it.
It is so horrific to have to even report on, let alone, I'm sure, the stories that you heard directly from some of these people who suffered, who have suffered through this, and it continues on. And as you have seen, in your opinion, which is so crucial, is that you see this as essentially a state policy now, a systemic policy, which will be directed from Russian leadership. Dr. Alice Jill Edwards, thank you very much for your work and for coming on. We'll continue to follow it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
John.